So yeah, there's my info. My name is Chelsea Trevino. Okay, so just to give you guys a rundown, I'm just going to kind of go over Bozeman's water source a little bit, and then interesting, category value. That's well. Either way, I'm going to go over like where our water comes from a little bit, how we use it in Bozeman, and then we're going to kind of talk more about like xeriscaping and doing more of your landscape to reduce water usage. So this is interesting.
It's probably because the font, it doesn't recognize the font, so when you change it to a PDF, it erases your font choice.
Oh.
Okay, well, hopefully I don't give you wrong percentages.
Well, I guess do the colors correspond with?
Well, yeah, so
you don't have the number.
but that's okay, yeah. So the highlight reservoir, as I'm sure you guys have been there, that is 40% of Bozeman's water. And then Lyman Springs is 20%. And then the Bozeman Creek is 30%. I think. Yeah, I know. But anyways, so we on average use about 6 million gallons a day that gets pumped out, and we rely on surface water. So, or rather snowpack. And so Bozeman, the city of Bozeman, you know, there's a lot of people with exempt wells, and they can't irrigate with wells, they can dig their own wells, but that's not a part of the city water. The city water all comes from snowpack melt. And so if we have a really crappy snow season, or if it all gets melted early on in the season, then later on in the summer, we are struggling. So that's kind of where our water comes from. So this chart just shows kind of the supply and the demand of water. And on the x-axis are the years, and then we have the population. So basically right now, the reliable source that we have is 11,500 acre feet. I have a graphic later to show that, but in case you guys don't know, that's basically a football field with a foot of water filled. So once we reach that point, which would be about 83,000 people in the city of Bozeman, we will meet the demand will meet the supply. And this is approximately on this graph, and just so you know, this is just a black and white. It's only taking into account the population growth, that average of 4.3% growth rate for the city of Bozeman. And that water source is not taking into account drought, or the fact that our reservoir might be decreasing faster in addition to the population growth. So this takes away all those other things that we had to consider this year. And so we actually will exceed our supply. The demand will exceed the supply approximately 2021. And engineering is doing a separate study right now. It's called the optimization study to kind of determine if there's other outlets, for example, groundwater, and really hone in on this number. And because things have changed, and I'm not even sure if 4.3% is still the case. And so this was a rough graph created. So it's kind of a scary graph. So in 2017, we created the drought management plan, and basically outlines what we would do if we were to be in a drought, which we currently are in the city of Bozeman. And so, without having this plan in place, we wouldn't have known what to do, basically. There wouldn't have been a set of indicators and all this stuff. So this was a very important piece to get laid out before things got severe. And so basically we would do vulnerability assessments. And so, keeping track, just like with the drought monitoring, that kind of plays in together. We have a drought monitor tool that we run. In the summer, we run it every day. In the winter, we run it depending on like every 2 weeks, just kind of depends on where we're at. And that takes into account local stream flows, the reservoir level, and it does take into account snowpack, but only in October. So like we're about to switch basically. Right now it's pulling most of the weighted percentages off the reservoir data, because that's like majority of the city's water. So we will switch those indicators. It also takes the US Drought Monitor tool information into account as well. It's a really complicated tool, Excel sheet that we just run. So then again, the drought response and actions. So basically this drought management plan outlines if we're in stage 1, if we're in stage 2, what's going to take place, and what is like the bare minimum that needs to happen to help reduce our water usage. It also indicates like percentage reductions for the entire system wide. And then drought communications, which we had to actually implement this year, and you know, kind of reaching out to restaurants and all those people to try to help get the word out. And then drought response measures, which we did go into a lawn watering restriction for the city of Bozeman this summer. So that's in stage 2. We've since moved back into a stage 1. So we are currently in a stage 1. The drought score unfortunately increased after the fact, but fingers crossed, you know, the snow will fly and it'll be somewhat average. Because unfortunately, since we switched our drought tool over to snowpack majority, then, you know, if that's not average, or basically it takes a percent exceedance, which means, you know, based on 10 years worth of data on that day, is the flow of water either higher or lower? Same with the snowpack. Is the snowpack higher or lower than the historical data? And so, depending on what comes of winter, like that can still be, we can still be in a stage 1 drought even throughout the winter for the city. And then up there just defines drought, because there's no single definition for drought. And that is Bozeman's definition is basically below normal water supplies, such as stream flow, groundwater, snowpack, and reservoir levels that result from a prolonged reduction in precipitation.
I have a question, or would you like me to wait till the end?
No, and if you guys have questions at any point in time, feel free to
Okay.
shout them out, yeah.
Thanks. So you mentioned the restrictions on lawn watering this past summer, I remember. Do you guys do any kind of monitoring of that, or?
That's kind of a tricky situation. We did actually create like violation door hangers, and at which point we're gonna have like the police actually distribute those if they were driving around, and to see that somebody was not abiding. That would typically only take place if there was a stage 3 and it was a full-on ban. But this year with just the stage 2, we were pretty much relying on neighbors. And we had a complaint box on our website. People were calling, we kept track. Unfortunately, if you do use well water to irrigate, they didn't have to abide by the restrictions. And so many times that was the case. They were calling on their neighbors, but they actually had well water instead of city water.
I see.
But we still called them and was like, hey, you don't have to comply, but we were, you know, requesting if you are so inclined to do so, like that'd be awesome. But yeah, the enforcement aspect is rather challenging, and because it basically takes boots like on the field out there, driving around looking for culprits. And I actually did write down a number of addresses myself, you know, just doing assessments throughout the city and driving around.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's something, you know, moving forward, and I think honestly might just even take getting more people in our division to really fully get that in place. But yeah, I think, you know, moving forward, if we were to go into a stage 3 next summer, then we definitely would be getting involved and having them assist us in putting out those violations. So
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you.
By law, is there much you can do though, by? I mean, even by enforcement wise, is there much you can do?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
That is kind of an oversight on our part when this plan was put in place. It is actually a misdemeanor which means we would have to take them to court.
Hmm.
So, that would be like really severe people who are in violation, continually. We would go that route if it was somebody who consistently, just was not complying. But for the most part, we had really receptive results, and people, right off the bat, either, they're out of state, they were unaware, or, I only talked to one person that fought me on it. So, and we made several calls, almost 100 people got calls. So I think for the most part, even just calling, communicating that warning to them and giving them the information, again, a lot of people just didn't even know. So I think that has a big effect. So hopefully we would never have to go down that route. Any more questions? Okay. So this is showing outdoor water use. Now this is specifically data for Bozeman. And so it was taken 2016 through 2020. And they are sectioned out by customer class. So on the x-axis we have the months, and then these are millions of gallons used on the y-axis. And so single family homes are in green. And so you can see here, they're the ones using the most water for lawns, because that's summer usage. And so we can basically identify winter versus summer by using winter water usage as a normalization factor. So yeah, pretty big. And basically in July and August, 70% of single family water use is used outside landscapes. So kind of just goes to show how much water is actually being dumped out onto landscapes. A lot of it's just maybe lack of knowledge and understanding, or they just have that really lush green grass and that's all they have and they're dumping it on. So yeah, so this is based on the customer classes.
MSU is on the city's water?
They are, they're on like a master meter, which is like the only account. Their irrigation is not.
Oh, okay.
So that's very important to point out, because I
It's pretty
can't tell.
low.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people call us about MSU, which I used to live near campus, so I'm fully aware. And that was like cringing every time I walked past in the rain. But they actually have their own surface reservoir that they use for their irrigation. So they're not using city treated water. They're not using treated water at all to irrigate. That's water that they have.
So I have a question. Could
Yeah.
you explain though, like, as far as here using the snowpack versus what the aquifer holds? Because obviously whatever water is here, and that all comes into that aquifer one way or another if it leaches into the ground, correct? So is that monitored at all, like what you do have for aquifers here, or is that not?
That is what the water engineer is currently studying. So, they're trying to get an idea of that, but groundwater was kind of my thing in college. I love it. And I have to admit that it's so mystical, and like, I have friends who work for USGS, and basically there's like a bazillion assumptions that go into that value of what is actually below our feet. And so it's never 100% accurate, and you have to have all those values to assume before you can get the quantity. And so it is rather complicated to calculate in any case. And so the answer, no, we do not know how much water, and especially because the exempt well situations over the state of Montana, you can just, if you don't use over 10 acre-foot per year of water, which is actually quite a bit of water, you can just dig a well and nobody ever monitors it. You get a permit for it and it's done. And so there's also that factor. Like, there's people with so many exempt wells out there, and are they pulling more? There's no way to know that. And so then there's that also. And so yeah, it's just all complicated because, there's different topographies underground. So if it's consolidated, not consolidated, that all makes a big difference on its depletion status too. So we don't know that as a city, but we're looking into it. Okay, so this is a graph from the USDA But basically just showing you that lawn is basically the most irrigated in the US. And so that's 40.5 million acres of just lawn. And so if you go to the next slide, that is 59.6 million acre feet of water used in a year. And then if you want to hit the button again.
Yeah, next.
Yeah, I have a little graphic.
Oh, cute.
So again, that is a football field filled with a foot of water, which is a lot of water. So yeah, just imagine 59.6 million football fields. So that's why lawn is just like, why do we have it? I don't quite understand. I mean, I get there's like a luxury aspect to it. I think it's become culture, it's like shows that you have money or something, but yeah, that's why I kind of want to focus in on now, what are our alternatives to turf?
And by turf, you just mean grass, like normal lawn?
Yeah, because specifically Kentucky bluegrass. Because there are fescue seed blends, and a lot of cases, those fescue blends, once they're established, as long as you have good topsoil, you don't even need to irrigate them. A lot of times, we did actually just plant in, and I'll show that here, on North 27th Boulevard or medians in Bozeman, and so we just planted the fescue seed there, and so our goal is to not have to irrigate it within 2 summers. So this summer and next summer. So then by 2023, we're hoping to just not have to irrigate anymore and it'll be fine. So we'll test that out. So yeah, this comes from the residential end use study from the US. And so it just kind of shows you where you use water indoors, and toilets win by far. So just keep that in mind. Also check for leaks in your toilets. I need to bring toilet dye tablets. And then just, so on average, 50% of summer usage goes to outdoors. And so I did a little bit of math, and based on Bozeman's numbers, the average single family outdoor water use on a given irrigation day in August or July is about 390 gallons. So if you were to irrigate 4 times a week, which is the average in Bozeman that I have found, that's about 1,560 gallons a week. And in July and August, that is about 12,500 gallons a month, which is insane. And it's very true, because I have received so many calls already of people with the drought, they're paying attention to their water bill. But essentially water bills and the water usage doubles with irrigation. If you just want to, it's gonna ping all of.
Oh, okay.
You can just go
All of them.
till it says
Oh, sorry.
no. So the city has done some larger projects, the Water Conservation Division, and so we've done the North 7th medians. I'm sure if you guys drove down 7th Street last year, you saw them installing the permeable bricks, because that was a pain for months, the traffic on 7th. But hey, it's gonna save water. And so that's all there. And the medians actually are growing pretty nicely. We did test the water usage with a basically all turf median, and the 7th Street medians use 86% less water than the turf site that we compared it to. Yeah. And then mind you, that is, drip irrigation, not overhead spray irrigation, which makes a big difference too. And then North 27th, that is this picture here. They're babies, they're brand new. They were just done like 2 weeks ago. So we're really excited. But this is that fescue blended seed, and it's actually already growing. It looks great already. And so I'm really anxious to see how that turns out. And then the City Hall demonstration garden, we just kind of revamped it up as well and added a lot more plants to that. So if you guys are looking for inspiration, that is a good place, City Hall. And then also the Museum of the Rockies demonstration gardens, we have part in that as well, with MSU. And so that one looks great and they're like really established there, so. The Museum of the Rockies.
Did you say that plants were doing better than the grass? And do you think that's because their deep rooted system versus grass is so shallow? You know, like those natives and things,
You mean
They're-
this 86%?
yeah, do you think that's why they're doing better? Because they're better rooted?
I don't, and I mean, I guess that could be the case if it was the topsoil issue that we kind of talked about, if it didn't have enough topsoil in the grass, but just in general, drought tolerant plants use 75% less
Water.
grass.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think overall, and actually, if you didn't have good topsoil, these plants would probably
be
still
okay.
do better than
Mhm.
turf regardless. But yeah, they just use less water, and we'll kind of talk about the difference between drought tolerant versus water smart, I think it is.
Okay.
So the rebates are only good for city water rate payers, so sorry, Wendy.
It's okay.
Or I don't know, Elizabeth, do you live in Bozeman?
Oh, great.
So tell your friends if you live, I think you traveled, you said you live in Bozeman?
Yeah, I run
Nice.
in Bozeman, but it's interesting.
Yeah, so we offer these rebates. They're also in this guide that I meant to pass out to you, so I'm done, but, and then if you wanna push forward once more.
Sure.
And then we do free sprinkler system assessments, so this is huge, and it depends on if the homeowner utilizes the watering schedule, but that's the biggest component to it because, on average, people are irrigating about 500 to 600 gallons of water a week. Which once we look at their schedule and say, oh, this is full shade, it shouldn't be 30 minutes and it can actually do just fine with 10 minutes. Or, like we take all of that stuff into consideration. And so super helpful. If people utilize the schedules, then they're actually reducing quite a bit. And a lot of people doing these assessments, they just don't even know that they have multiple start zones set or multiple programs set. For example, I went to this young guy's house and he was like, oh yeah, well, I haven't even been running it all season. And I looked at some of his vegetation and I'm like, this is really looking good. Like I have a feeling you're running something. And then we go to look at and he's running it for 4 hours, 3 days a week. And so he was like, what? He had no idea. And so just trying to help empower people on how to use, look at their programming.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about drought tolerant versus water smart plants. So we're gonna go into like the landscape aspect. Do you guys have any questions about city water use for Bozeman? So there's drought tolerant. Basically, the drought tolerant ones do better. They can do without water after they're established. And so a lot of people don't realize there's a difference, drought tolerant versus water smart. But there are certain plants that will not survive with just no irrigation, even once they're established. And those are water smart. And then in this booklet, as I guess I can just pass them out to you guys now. But basically in the back, it has a full list and it kind of tells you what is and isn't drought tolerant versus water smart, if you're curious. And so basically, like I said, drought tolerant can do without water, and especially if you're having to ration water. The water smart, they most likely will not survive if you give them no water. And so overall, both of these plants use on average 50 to 75% less water than turf grass. Again, when we say turf grass, we're really talking about sod, specifically Kentucky bluegrass.
question.
Yeah.
This might be a dumb question, I'm mostly
Yeah.
asking because my family lives in the Midwest, so we do get more water, but can drought tolerant plants be overwatered?
I'm sure that they can, yes.
In Wisconsin, they can be.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Just because obviously,
Yeah.
I mean, we would benefit from those kind of plants at certain periods or times in the year, especially with, I mean, how the climate is changing, but you wonder, because it's not that we don't have any,
Yeah, I think
it's not like a drought.
that's a
period.
very good question. And I would say, yeah, so for example, so I don't know if you guys know, and I'm gonna fail, but basically there's like a hardiness zone map.
Yeah.
Like the plants and everything, and so, I don't have it memorized, but I'm pretty sure anything 4 and
Shame on
below. I'm not a plant expert.
That's hard.
Don't let this mislead you.
No.
But,
Just curious, I haven't really thought about
But yeah, I think if you were to really be curious and wanna like do something, have your family install something, I would advise looking at that hardiness map and just seeing, which of the water smart or drought tolerant plants could actually do fine in these areas, regardless of that additional water. But it is true, I have seen, I think it was an aspen tree, which, they need water, but once they're established, they're pretty good. But this gal was over irrigating it. She had a leak in her drip system and it was completely dead. So she didn't know why. We started the assessment and she was like, I don't understand why this is dead. Turns out there was a leak. So yeah, I think in any case, over irrigation
Yeah.
can kill, but I would say take a look at that map for sure
Thanks.
to know. And then just the rule of thumb for the water smart plants would be 1 to 2 times per week during July and August. I know a lot of people water more than that, even with their perennial gardens and stuff, but ideally you would never want to irrigate more than 3 days a week, even in the hottest heat of the summer.
Even for a vegetable garden?
No.
No.
No, we don't really delve into vegetable gardens, and that's one thing that was exempt with the drought watering restrictions, because some people rely on that as their food source, so, we can't really restrict that.
Right.
But definitely not, and we were actually to add garden vegetables into our plant guide, but then none of them are water efficient, so we just didn't. But yeah, slow, deep, and infrequent, that's a really important, just overall general rule for turf also, is just that, because we have clay soils here, and so, it can absorb lots of water, but once it's maxed, and all that water is just gonna run off. And so it does need time in between irrigation, to absorb, so we call that a cycle and soak. So here's some information just basically about, what makes drought tolerant or water smart plants. And so I did put labels on some of these, little the labels before, but there's silver sagebrush. I don't know about the sedums out in the xeriscape garden, so we can take a look at that one. But yeah, hairy leaves basically hold water a little better. You can see the hairy leaves here. The waxy leaf surface prevents water loss, so they can keep that water inside. That would be the sedums over there. And then the small gray or silver leaves to reflect sun's heat would be sagebrush. And then, they do have the deep taproots, kind of like what you're seeing, but they grow, vertically downwards and then extensive lateral roots as well. So that makes a big difference. Anything that has lateral roots is going to be way more tolerant, drought tolerant, and disease resistant as well. Oh, and this is again, if you want to.
Sure.
I kind of stole some of these slides and put as many action moves on it, but okay, so if we get into the idea of like thinking, if you want to transform your landscape, these are kind of some pros and cons, if you will, about the perennials versus shrubs. A lot of people just, take out turf or don't even take out turf, they just dig a hole and plant their shrubs. And they are way easier to maintain. You don't have to do much with them. And they work well with weed mat, although I don't advise weed mat at all. From my experience and what I've heard from lots of people, they can just collect dust on top and then your weeds grow right on top. Also, it's not good to have your drip irrigation underneath the weed mat because then you can't access it and identify leaks. So, but apparently shrubs do work a little better with the weed mat. Rock mulch works better with the shrubs. And then that can also help reduce the weed growth compared to organic mulch. The bad thing about shrubs, they have less diversity and less blooming. So if we talk about perennials, and this is how the Museum of the Rockies garden was designed to have a flower in bloom every month of the summer, basically, because that's when you use perennials, you can think, oh, well, this one will bloom at the beginning. And then once that dies off, this one will then bloom. And so you have a continuous bloom of flowers, which is kind of nice. You can have more diversity with that. And then organic mulch works better if you're not into the rocks. And that can also, well, it helps retain moisture, but then if you can plant more densely to help mediate the weed growth. But then yes, there's a higher maintenance and there's more room for weeds to grow, kind of depending on how dispersed they are on the landscape. So this is actually the Museum of the Rockies bed when it was brand new. As you saw before, it's definitely overgrown now, but this would be kind of an ideal setup with drip irrigation. And so if you are considering moving from turf to perennials or drought tolerant plantings, one of the first things you'll want to consider is what type of irrigation do you already have in the turf? A lot of people take out the turf and they leave the overhead sprays and then they plant their drought tolerant plants, but they're actually still wasting just as much water as they did before because that overhead spray isn't made to target the roots like drip irrigation is. And so drip irrigation is literally the most efficient irrigation that you could utilize if you were going to. So again, it targets the roots, minimizes the water loss, especially with evaporation, runoff, and wind drift is a huge water loss in Bozeman, I'm sure.
We don't know what wind is in Manhattan.
You probably have it worse here.
It's so bad.
So yeah, and then the lower precipitation rate, and precipitation rate just means how much water is being dumped out inches per hour. And so that allows for that clay soil to really absorb that water and make use of it as opposed to running off. And so there are different versions of drip irrigation. And so that would be, drip irrigation. This is kind of confusing. There's drip irrigation with emitters. And so I'm sure you guys have seen like spaghetti tubing, like imagine like, a 1/4-inch tube off of these 1/2-inch tubes with an emitter on the bottom that can go right into the root. That's like the most ideal drip irrigation that you could install. And that would get right down into the root. Also, I had one gal, she's like, I just move my plants around a lot. And it's a really good way to be able to also then move the irrigation because then you can kind of reposition that emitter wherever you need. And it's better for sparsely planted beds. But yeah, again, if your plants grow and your emitters might move around, so that's something to keep in mind if you have to adjust them. The inline drip tubing, which is what is shown in this photograph, I don't really like it. If I was going to do an alteration, I would go with the drip tubing and with emitters. The reason being is because the inline drip tubing is already punctured. You buy it that way with the holes already spaced out every 12 inches approximately. And so that doesn't give you much room to design and like say, oh, I want this plant here and here. You'd have to make sure you're covering almost the entire space with this inline drip. which would be kind of expensive with the actual tubing itself. But as far as not piecing it together, it would be the easiest route. But yeah, and again, that one's better, you know, if you've got a lot of dense plantings, and you don't need to just get the water into the one plant's roots. Oh, and then hydrazone, you guys know what hydrazone means? Yeah, just like plant things that use the same amount of water. A lot of people like to put their perennial beds that have drought tolerant plants on sprays with their irrigation, and that's a design issue. It's not necessarily the homeowner's choice, but that's a big no-no, because then you are either over irrigating the turf grass or under irrigating the turf grass, and vice versa for the perennials. Okay, now you guys ready to use your graph paper? I don't know, this is just supposed to be like my fun project, but so I don't know, I thought it'd be cool if you guys could maybe like draw your space, your like if you have your garden boxes or whatever, if you were to think like things to consider too, you know, like trees, you want to draw where your home is, and you can actually advance a couple of times. I have like this. Yeah, that's good. Oh,
Should I go back?
you go back, yeah. So yeah, so this would be the first step if you were to do landscape alteration, if you were to want to take out turf grass. And in the booklets I gave you, there is a how-to, which has these images of, you know, if you were to cut it out versus just putting cardboard over, mulch over, that actually takes quite a bit of water initially, but then you get rid of your grass and you can plant over it. And it can actually take a couple of seasons, just since our summer season is so short and not that hot. So when you go to draw your property, you want to consider fences, trees, hard surfaces, your home, and north or east facing areas. Those are going to need the least amount of water. And then landscape slope is also really important, you know, because that water is going to run off and catch inside that little gully or whatever the lowest point is. So you can actually utilize those areas as kind of like catchment spaces to keep any water you get, but so you don't have to supplement it with irrigation. And so these things you want to note. Again, if you know you have overhead spray, you might want to note that as well. And just kind of think like, oh, well, if this tree is huge and shades this entire area, maybe that'd be a good place to keep my turf grass, knowing that I want to keep some of it because it's got shade. And so you don't have to irrigate it as much. Whereas, you know, if this is your north, this is your south, let's say this whole patch gets burnt up every season and never ever stays green, that would be a very good location to take the turf out and install some drought tolerant plants. So things like that to consider. But then also, how would you use the landscape? So if you were thinking, oh, like this is a back patio, and I want, you know, this area for extra chairs or something like that, you know, you could even take the turf out around that area and build, you know, extend your patio or something like that. And then play areas, if you have children or dogs, you probably want to keep some turf grass. So things like that could be considered. Privacy boundaries where you might plant shrubs instead of perennials to help kind of build that barrier. And then access to landscape, you know, for example, if you're going to leave this patch of grass here and then you surround it entirely with perennials beds, it might be challenging to get to and mow. So maintenance, things like that, like is this an easy accessible piece of turf grass that I've decided to keep? And then always consider, you know, full sun, partial sun. Also, the best sunlight is received on the west side of your home. If you're ever going to plant a tree, I highly recommend planting on the west side. And then drainage patterns. So if you want to click for that middle image, So drainage patterns are really good to consider along with that landscape slope. If you want to think about your landscape as a watershed. And, you know, I'm not advising rain capture because I can't do that based on state laws. But it's actually, yes, I'd recommend taking a look at your landscape and saying, where are these high and low lines? Can I actually increase the availability of water somehow so that I don't have to irrigate as much to keep my landscape looking nice? And so, you know, take a look at gutters and all that good stuff. If you want, I have one more. Sure. And so just kind of these 4 components to consider is that your soil is healthy. Again, if you don't have good topsoil or if it's really bad soil, it's probably not going to do so well even if you are dumping water on it. So that's a huge component to consider. And then again, going back to the plant selection, just selecting the climate appropriate plants, like to your point there, you know, if you know is an area that gets little to no sunlight, which by the way, turf doesn't like those areas. Typically those areas just become mucky mud if they're still being irrigated. And so things like that to consider. And then utilize the topography, you know, to increase your moisture capacity if you can. And then always use efficient irrigation practices. And on that note, in the little booklet, in the booklet as well as separate, I printed out water efficient irrigation guidelines. So if you have an irrigation system and you're wondering how to improve the efficiency of it, there's kind of a step guide. It also kind of explains how to troubleshoot issues if you see them. And just know that if you do have a system, that it's really not that challenging. There's lots of videos online. So, and I think that's the last one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's
Thank
kind
you.
of a fast presentation.
No, that was
That was good.